Okay, so I've let a few people in now. Nice to see everybody. I hope everyone's well. My name's Celine Elliott, for people who don't know me. I work for Cornwall Museums Partnership, as the engagement lead. Some of you I do know, some of you I don't, but you're all most welcome. And I'm really happy to be joined today, not only by all of you lovely people, but by Sophie Meyer from Queer Kernow, and also James Brandon and Dan Vo, who I've made co-host and who may at this point want to say a little hello and introduce themselves instead of me doing it for them. Sophie?
Okay. Hi, I'm Sophie. I am project lead on Queer Kernow, which is a CMP funded project looking at kind of queer Cornish history.
Thanks, Sophie.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Dan Vo. You may have seen me from Museum from Home. Museum from Home. So it's been great to kind of be able to do this while we're in lockdown and have chats with like almost 60 amazing people from the sector. And so I do the LGBTQ tours at the V&A, so hi Sarah, and also at Cambridge. We've got 7 museums that do LGBTQ tours there, and also am Geirvögen Cardiff, the National Museum Cardiff, and I was invited to Cornwall last year, so I came and I learnt that I eat my scones the wrong way by putting jam on one side, cream on the other side, and then mashing it together like a burger. Which I got a big no-no, and some of the faces that you've shown right now indicate that was really, really wrong, but it's a delight to be here today. James.
Hi, I'm James Brandon. I'm the Diversity Inclusion Manager for Tate Galleries, and I can see some of my colleagues are on the call, so hello everybody. Hello everybody, and I hope you're all safe and well. My role at Tate is one that looks kind of strategically across all of our galleries to work out how we can better represent groups that have been marginalized in the past and continue to be erased or underrepresented. And we've done some very exciting work across all of the galleries that under the Tate umbrella. And over the last year in particular, there's been some really exciting stuff that's happened in St. Ives. I'm really proud of the work of the team there. And I'm looking forward to exploring more of that today.
Thanks, James. That's lovely. I know somebody's already started. If you'd like to drop your name in the chat and say where you work or where you're associated with or anything about yourself, you're most welcome to. This is a sort of rough network meeting, in as much as we're hoping to talk a bit more shortly about the Queer Kernow project, and it'd be great to have as many people on board with that and moving forward with it as possible. So if you don't mind, if you'd like to introduce yourself using the chat function, that'd be fantastic. We'll also use that for questions throughout, but there's going to be, you will have seen from the agenda that I shared, a time for breakout rooms and more building questions as well. But sometimes I think of something and then it's gone later, so feel free to jot it down in the chat and we can definitely come to it if something occurs to you in the moment. It's not a massively formal affair today. It's just a chance to take this project forward from the first stage to the second stage. Okay then, so without further ado, the only other thing I'd like to say is I'm recording at the moment so that we can share this resource with people who haven't been here, haven't been able to be with us today. But what I'll do is I'm going to press stop once we get past the first introductory bit from Dan and Sophie, and then the breakout rooms are unrecorded. The idea is we can have totally frank and open conversations with each other, so don't feel, because I know it can actually affect the way you feel when you're being recorded. But the first section will be recorded, and then I'll let people know when I'm going to stop recording. The only other thing I wanted to say is thank you to you all. Thank you for joining us, but also thank you to Arts Council England for supporting this work that we've been doing for a while now at CMP. Okay, without further ado, I'm going to check the waiting room, but Dan, I think you might be our first port of call in terms of thinking about any objects that we were going to introduce in Cornish queer history.
Fab. So this is the part where everyone will join in with an object that they may have as well. I think you've been given a bit of homework. Don't worry if you haven't got an object. That's part of the exercise today as well. But I think part of what I wanted to share as well was, as I said earlier, I was invited to Cornwall last year to speak, and I was super excited to be at Cornwall Pride as well and meet the Pride team, and also get to see the march as well, which was fantastic. I just loved the community feel. It reminded me of, you know, sort of where I grew up in Melbourne, where it is a very, very community aspect. So the thing that I wanted to kind of contribute today, that is a Cornish queer link, which I originally was going to pick an artist. I was going to do Cedric Morris rather, who was called the Cézanne of Newlyn. But I decided instead to actually kind of do what I consider to be sort of like a way of re-queering your own collections, which is, so I grabbed a photo, so I'm going to share my own photo. Can you see that? Or does that, the reflection, oh no, hang on, if I just do that, yeah. So that is Royal Cornwall Museum, and as you can see, to welcome me to the space and welcome all the visitors to the space for LGBT History Month last year, lots of flags of solidarity and support were flown from the banister, which I thought was just a wonderful way of welcoming everybody to the space. So that's going to be my contribution. It's quite easy and light, and I think this is part of the way that I like to have people think about the collections, which is it's very much your own lens that you bring into the space, or the LGBTQ plus communities that you work with. What they see in the collection is really important as well. And I think some might be also talking about sort of contemporary collecting as well. But for me, that was a really wonderful show of community spirit in the museum. So did anybody else have an object that they wanted to share? I know that James and Sophie do as well, and I hope you have one as well, Celine, but maybe we'll put you in at middle points. So if anybody's got one to share now, raise your hand and I'd love to. You want to go first, Sophie? All right, go on. I hand over to Sophie, and if you could pick the next person, Sophie, that'd be wonderful.
Okay, I decided to bring out my lovely football that I made with the Intercom Trust. And I went to, the Intercom Trust is a lovely queer youth group that runs throughout Cornwall. They run school sessions and go in and do lunchtime sessions, learning and doing artistic things with the kids. And I went to one of their after school sessions in Truro to teach them a little bit and just open the conversation about queer history. And I didn't want to kind of come and be prescriptive and dominate. So I just said, I'll come along and join in with whatever artwork you're doing or crafting. And what the amazing Tina, who runs the session, had done was make these footballs, and they're all different pride flags, and they were learning the history of all the different flags. And one of the kids made me this, and obviously I had to keep it. But my favorite flag, which I think is really says a lot, is this one, which just says "incorrect flag peasants," because they got the colors wrong. And and I just really love the fact that you know, they're really celebrating all the different ones, but they're still kids, they're still learning, they're not quite sure, they're still getting to grips with things. And I really just like that dichotomy of here are all the flags, but here's one they actually just got wrong and decided to make a little joke out of. So yeah, that's my queer object. Okay, anyone else like to go next?
Sophie, I'm quite happy to talk about something that I'm, you know, passionate about in terms of Cornish queer art and artists, in terms of the work of Gluck, and I just think that in their work you see something which is 100 years old and couldn't be more modern. So I'm sure most people here will be familiar with Gluck's work, but a painter who moved from London to Cornwall and was way ahead of a lot of people in terms of rejecting pronouns, suffixes, gender norms, was gender fluid, and it's just a fascinating person, but a brilliant artist. So it seems to kind of speak to a lot of things that I'm sure people in this digital space are interested in, which is artistry, creativity, and then something about identity, and also through a Cornish lens or a Cornish perspective. But I'll save you holding my phone up to the lens, and you can have a look yourselves. James, who did you want to speak about?
So when we were meeting earlier, Dan managed to see on I have a wall of postcards behind me from every art exhibition that I've been part of at Tate, mostly because I come from a sport background. So coming to Tate was my first real arts and heritage job role. So I use these postcards as a bit of an education tool for myself and also to remember all the work. But one of the greater things when I started, and was gold really as a diversity inclusion manager, was the Queer British Art exhibition at Tate Britain happened within the first 6 months of my arrival. And one of the postcards that we found is of Henry Scott Tuke, who has a big relationship with Newlyn, and lots and lots of conversations about, is there a queer aesthetic, is there a queer lens, is there a homoerotic lens? And I think the artist and the production of what they have, and the conversation about what queer history is and what queer is today, really are symbiotic to this artist, and really important things that we can draw upon and have really great discourse in 2020. But yeah, so that's my object. Who else might have an object? Anybody want to wave a hand?
I'm slightly prepared for this sort of silence, because I know a lot of people, when I've sounded them out, have been like, I don't know where to start and I haven't got anything. And I know a couple of people have been really kind and emailed over suggestions, and I think I've got this starting point, but I completely understand if people don't want to be put on the spot and suggest anything at this point. So maybe if we move into our next section, Dan, would you like to speak a little bit?
Sure. You haven't done your homework, shame. No. I think what we'll do is I'd like to seed the idea that by the end of this, you should be able to think of something from your collection. I had a conference with you, James, a few years ago, and I think I've identified your picture from that particular conference. So I've kept this big thing. I was prepared for this inevitability as well. So there is a loo break coming up. In fact, what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to drop into the chat the agenda, so you can see the agenda and sort of the layout of what is happening today. You'll see that there's going to be some breakouts that are coming up a little bit later, where you'll have Celine, myself, James, and Sophie. I'm just reading across the screen that I've got here. We're going to break out into different sessions and ask different questions that will help you kind of be able to identify things in your collection. Because I think for me, I will talk a little bit about the theory of how we do the tours at the different museums that I do them at. But the conference I was talking about, where James was at, this was for the MA, and I can't remember exactly which one it was. I'm sure it revolved around diversity and inclusion. But we effectively made a giant rainbow thing. And everybody was invited to come up with a different object from their collection that would help tell stories of inclusion and diversity. And there was one from, I'm thinking that this is probably Sasha Coward's. It's relating to Queen Anne. And the question was, was Queen Anne a queer queen? The one that I think is yours, James, is here, which is the British Library by Yinka Shonibare, acquired for the Tate with Art Fund grant. Was that yours? No? Okay.
This was like 3 years ago, I think, this conference. It might have been.
So it was a room full of around about 50 or 60 people. And by the end of it, we had an entire, wall-sized kite, which I've kept because I rather like it. It wasn't about people's abilities to draw or anything like that. It was more about using the objects as a basis to tell stories of inclusion and diversity. Personally, I've just completed 1,000 days of doing Queer VAM, which is looking at objects from the V&A collection that I kind of Photoshop out and then put on a nice color background. And it's about finding stories from the collection and fixating onto a calendar. So every single day there's a different story. And what I found really interesting about that was it forced me to look beyond what was the standard story. There's things in your collection that often you kind of go to and kind of go, yo, those are the stars, those are the treasures that we have in the collection, and they become the default. And by having a randomized way of looking for stories, it suddenly meant that we opened up our eyes to a whole lot of stories, a whole lot of different stories. What was the cue for this was a friend from Scotland had come down to see my tour at the V&A, LGBTQ+ tours. We've been doing them at the V&A since 2015, so I've been doing them for 5 years now. It was one of the early tours that I did, so I was super green behind the ears, and she came with me for drinks afterwards and said, you've got some great stories, but there's not enough diversity. I need more female stories, women's stories, I need more people of colour stories. And at the time, I think when we did a lot of the research, we all kind of fixated on the idea that, oh, it's mostly, you know, rich white men that we tell the stories of because they're the ones that are recorded. This forced me to kind of look into alternative directions, and after I've done the 1,000 days now, I've done a kind of like a rough split of it all, and we have about 50-50. If you want to do it, binary genders, there's like male stories and then others, and then there's about 30% people of color stories as well. So what I thought was the nature of our collection was totally not true, and so that is very much what I kind of always like to approach an LGBTQ tour with. So there's the 3 collections that I've done it for, and each have had a slightly different way of doing it. And from the V&A, it was from the ground up. So I was a volunteer, a front of house volunteer, and I pitched the idea through to the Friday Late team because, you know, they're always up for new content. At the Cambridge museums, there's 7 museums that we do them at. So there's the Polar Museum, which is where I'm still connected to, the Fitz, which is very much like a bit like a V&A, and there's also the Zoology Museum, which is where the penguins also come up, and there's if you Google my name, there's weird things that come up with penguin sex. It's to do with the fact that animals, you know, we look at the animal queendom, and there's more than 1,400 species that engage in homosexual behavior, for example, and that's how we look at the LGBTQ stories and narratives in a natural history collection. We have the Whipple, which is our science museum. There's also the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, so we're looking at not only just LGBTQ+ narratives, but also decolonizing the collection as well, and looking at from a looking at multiple cultures and looking at it from a non-white perspective as well. So we always go to the source community and work with them to uncover the stories. Often we find that the stories have been suppressed, obliterated because of the colonial contact, the very violent colonial contact that has removed a lot of these stories, but it is possible to reinterpret a lot of them. There are tricky bits as well, which if we want to, we can discuss in some of the breakout sessions. And yeah, so there is a diversity of collections in Cambridge, and I think I was brought on to do what became the model for the Cardiff system as well, which is to kind of go in and find the stories and come up with a set of cards that a volunteer, so there's still volunteer-led tours, a volunteer can kind of look at the deck of cards that are available at that museum and kind of go, ooh, I like that card, that card, that card. I'll piece these together to make a group of 10 that I will talk about because those ones, I really like those stories that relate to me. But we also always make sure that there is a full representation of the spectrum. So we call them LGBTQ+ tours. So therefore we have to tell an LGBTQ+ story. Not a box ticking exercises in such a rigid way, but we do want to say that we do these tours because we're effectively saying our museums are reflective of the community and of our communities around us. And we have a responsibility in shaping culture and community as well, but we want to be able to say we are open to you and these collections are yours. You know, your taxpayer money pays for these collections, but these are your collections and we want to reflect you. And so for me, part of that is to use a system of 3. I have a Venn diagram that I always like to show my volunteers when we first start training them, and I've trained, I think we're up to group 7 now at the V&A. So I have a Venn diagram of 3 circles, and it is the biography of the maker, the the biography of the sitter or the subject, and I won't give away the third one. Maybe if someone wants to chime in what they think it is. I'm going to try to do audience participation with a Zoom. I've not done this before. We'll see how this goes. Does anyone know? And I don't know if I should let Sarah answer, because you know the answer to this, don't you, Sarah? Does anyone know what the third circle should be? I think it's the most important circle. Who wants to have a go? Come on.
Go on, Sarah, you say.
Okay. Well, I'm looking at all of you, and that is what I look to. It is the community. So if we were on a tour together and we were standing at, what have we got? The Statue of David, for example, at the V&A. So that's our sculpture of the Statue of David. If we were standing there, I would say, look to your left and look to your right. In this case, look to this group Zoom. It is the community that fulfills that most important part, which is what a member of the community who is from the LGBTQ+ community, so that might be yourself, what you see when you come to the collection, I say is as important as what a curator might have spent an entire lifetime studying and writing about. That lived experience that is brought to the museum is crucial to making these LGBTQ+ tours work. And for me, there is two really good examples of that, and I don't have them there, but it's okay. Oh, actually, I've got it on my screen. So this is a really interesting item that seems to follow my work. It follows my work, but it's because it's mostly everywhere. This is a traditional representation of this being, and then you have a contemporary, this was created just this year, a contemporary representation of this being, which I find to be one of the most important, and it just completely expands a collection's viewpoint as to the stories that could be told. So that was at the V&A. This is the same being at the Fitzwilliam in Cambridge, and we found one in Cardiff as well. And this one in Cardiff is really interesting because it was collected by the Davy sisters, who donated a huge amount of their impressionist art to the museum. The being is Avalokiteshvara Guanyin. And when you can identify this being, it does open up amazing stories for you. So I was at Bloomsbury, the Bloomsbury group, where Vanessa Bell and Duncan Grant lived, which is Charleston Farmhouse out in Lewes, down in South England, near Brighton. And over the mantelpiece of the Charleston Farmhouse, in the final room in Duncan Grant's studio, there is a being that stands, and by looking at it and seeing that it has a 5-pointed crown, there's a very particular type of gorget it has around its neck. We were able to kind of, and the way that it stands with its hand in a prayer, you can kind of identify it as Avalokiteshvara Guanyin. And what's really interesting is that it's a being that starts off its journey, their journey in India as Avalokiteshvara, often translated to be the Lord of Compassion. It takes a 1,000-year journey across China, so over the Himalayas into China, and as it goes into different communities, these different communities interpret this one being in different ways. And for it to be received, they often add attributes that belong to the god or goddesses of that particular region. And so it starts to take on all these other elements that weren't there before. So by the time it reaches China, it is increasingly androgenized. So what was a male figure is increasingly androgenized and feminized. And by the time it moves across East Asia into Japan, Korea, or where I'm from, which is Vietnam, it becomes a female goddess known as Guanyin, sometimes associated as the goddess of mercy, but the idea of mercy and compassion are both there in both elements. And in collections, they may call it Avalokiteshvara, or they may call it Guanyin, or they may just sort of say, well, it's a transitional being, as most of the ones that I've just shown you are. And so therefore it's Avalokiteshvara Guanyin. For me, it's really important because you're looking at a being that starts off their journey as male and then ends their journey as female. But in our time, of course, these beings all exist concurrently. And so you have a being that is neither male nor female, transcends gender as well, because it is a Buddhist icon. And in the Buddhist faith, you would say to fixate on the body and to fixate on gender, you won't reach enlightenment. That's a folly. You need to transcend all of that. And so it's a being that transcends gender as well. And when we were doing some work at the V&A, and then ultimately Laura Ball took this up and did the work in the Burrell collection, which is still yet to open its doors. It's in a huge renovation, so it hasn't had its doors open for about a year or two now. Laura was able to get trans and non-binary communities to come to the museum to sit with the curators and look at these and sort of go, what do you see in these objects? And ultimately the communities allowed the museum to say that the lived experience of trans and non-binary people can be represented in this being. And so there's, for me, that's a really powerful story to say, here is an ancient representation of a way of looking at gender in different ways from a different part of the world. And it also allows us to remind us that, you know, if we act with compassion, we're all better people. And in the same breath, we're talking about the trans and non-binary community as well. So for me, that's a great example of how an object can open up all these conversation points. It can be seen to be inclusive for the communities that come and want to be represented. And it also gives them an opportunity to share their own stories as well. So that's kind of what I hope, yeah, is going to kind of give you an idea of where to start with your objects. It is about opening up that third circle and saying that if you are from the LGBTQ+ community, please come and have a look at our objects with us, because what you see is really important to us, and you can help us understand the story of this object more. And therefore, when visitors come as well, we can all understand the stories of human history better as well. We're all going to be better for it. So that, I think, is kind of where I want to take it. In each of the collections that we work with, we have worked really hard with volunteers to be as inclusive and as diverse as possible. So that means that we work from a values-led perspective, and I'm sure that this is something that James will sort of discuss more in his breakout session as well. But for example, with our teams at the V&A, we often sort of sit at the table on the first session and just identify what gaps we have in the stories, who is not represented at the table, who's not sitting at the table with us, and so therefore what do we need to keep on working for in order to be wholly inclusive. So with trans and non-binary people, we do have them on the team. We could always do with more, and part of that is to also recognize that, yeah, we would like to amplify the stories of people who are often marginalized and make sure that they're heard. And so I might just kind of finish up with that, with another piece, which is to sort of say, this is my favorite piece at the V&A. It's not on display anymore because light from the balcony above hits it at a really, it's too bright for it, so we had to take it back into conservation. But it's an Olympic year. We should have seen it flying again this year. I don't know if you recognize it, so it's bright orange with a black stripe across it. Anyone? Any takers? Yes, Sarah, go on.
It's the refugee flag.
Wonderful, excellent. What else can you tell me about the refugee flag, Sarah?
So it's based on the design of a life vest. So you have the bright orange with the black stripe, which is the belt.
Wonderful, excellent. It is a beautiful piece, and I always like to take people there because I'm from a refugee family. And my mum was a boat person, so the idea of the life jacket, you know, being a lifesaver is really important. That black stripe that Sarah has noted, it also, for me, represents the horizons that are traversed and travailed by millions of people looking to flee different places of the world. For me, those millions of people in there represented will be LGBTQ+ people, because there is anti-homosexual laws in 70 countries in the world, and a very awful remnant of the British Empire is more than half of those countries, the Commonwealth countries that retain anti-homosexual laws, well, they were imported into those countries during the colonial period. And so I always like to go there in order to sort of talk about that with people and remind them that, you know, we have a role to play here in shaping community and culture, therefore, you know, fighting for equality and rights. We also could support people in other countries that are seeking reform for something that was, you know, a remnant of the British Empire as well. And our collections enable us to tell those stories that that help reform in those countries. And the reason why I also always like to show this flag is also the fact that when I did a tour there about 2 years ago, I had 3 women sort of stay back and wait for everybody to disperse and then have a chat with me afterwards. And they told me that they had flown in that morning to go on the tour because they came from a country, not a former Commonwealth country, but a country where the punishment was death by stoning if you were LGBTQ+. And they had flown in because they wanted to be in a space where they could just enjoy being LGBTQ+, and experience culture for just, you know, just an afternoon. And so, of course, you know, we spent the rest of the afternoon together. We went to the cafe, of course you would, and just had a good chat. And I think that's the remarkable thing about when you open up the collections. There are completely unexpected interactions that will happen, and for me that's one of the most important and life-changing experience for me moments. And I think that yeah, so that's why I always like to remember that yeah, you never know who you might touch when you open up the collections in this particular way. So that's the general theory for me, which I hope will allow you to kind of explore that thought a little bit more. There is the loo break coming up, which I'd love for, in that loo break, for you to kind of grab a piece of paper. I mean, the loo break's coming up in an hour or so, but so hold it in. And I'd love for you to grab a piece of paper and draw an object that may have sparked in your mind now while I've been talking, or when Sophie's going to be talking next, or during one of the breakouts. Maybe an object that you've got in your collection suddenly has changed its perspective for you now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. That was really, really lovely. And I think I'm probably speaking for myself here, but I think something in what you said there really makes me think about the ambition of what we hope to do, which is, yes, this is starting with Cornwall, but it's much broader, much bigger issues than anything we can contain and or we should think to. And that leads me to Sophie, because I'd like to introduce Sophie to talk a bit more about her ambitions for where she started with Queer Kernow and where we've got to. If you don't mind, Sophie.
Unmute first, must remember that. So I'm just going to give a bit of a background to where, over the last kind of 4 years, what work I've and the team at the Royal Cornwall Museum have been doing, and which has led to Queer Kernow. So we first went to Pride in 2017, took a rainbow cake, asked for some volunteers, just kind of tested the water. And what really came back to me that kind of spurred me on to do more with this community is, you know, I kept coming across the phrase, "Why are you here?" And I didn't realize that you would support us. And for me, it was obvious that queer history is, you know, a thing, and queers are everywhere in history, and especially in Cornwall, you know, there's so many different avenues you can go down. But if the community aren't feeling bolstered by the museum community down here, if they're feeling shut out and not welcome, I even had, it was my first interaction with the Intercom Trust, which is, like I said, that youth group. And, you know, some of the guys who run sessions came up and said, "Oh, would you mind if we brought a few of the kids around?" And I'm like, no, of course we wouldn't mind. Why would we mind? But the fact that they felt they had to ask permission before even stepping through the door of a publicly funded museum, it just kind of shouted to me that we really need to address this down here in Cornwall and make people realize that our museums are your museums. They are the collective whole. They are not to be kept away from you, and you should feel represented in your own museums. so from there, I spent some time kind of researching, queer history in Cornwall. And what we did at the next year at Pride is actually did some oral history collecting. We realized that, we needed to make the first step. We couldn't expect, the community were a bit too, shy and assumed that we weren't interested. So we needed to go out and do that contemporary collecting and talk to people. And I feel like that was breaking down the first barrier. It's like, okay, well, we've been 1 year, but we commit to going back year after year, bringing you more content, engaging with you, and then building up slowly. So we did some contemporary collecting, interviewing people saying, why is Cornwall Pride important to you? And what's your experience of being LGBTQ+ in Cornwall? And then those oral histories were accessioned into the permanent collections of the Royal Cornwall Museum. And that's a 200-year-old institution with just under 500,000 objects, and nothing in the MODES database was kind of tagged as LGBT, though it wasn't discussed. It was just a non-entity. So it was really important for me to make that change. And I think alongside that, welcoming in the queer community, offering them a space. So we had a lesbian poet come and read for LGBT History Month. We had a drag show this past year to launch Cornwall Pride. I made a petition which took about 8 months internally to get the Lose changed to gender neutral, which was one of the feedback I've had from the Intercom Trust, is that their kids, a lot of them are very vulnerable, and offering them kind of a place where they feel welcome instantly. Something like gender neutral Lose is an instant signifier that that organisation has thought about the LGBTQ+ community. And then from there, kind of going out to the Intercom Trust and doing talks about queer history with the children, doing a Radio Cornwall interview, and kind of really trying to bring together this history of queer Cornwall and hammer it home to not just within the museum sector, because there's always going to be some trustees that need convincing, but also from the community as well, to say, look, you are welcome, these are your museums. And that's ultimately my aim, is to get the queer community in Cornwall feel an ownership, and feel like they don't have to ask permission to engage with their own history, and that they feel represented. So ultimately that's my goal. And taking it forward with Queer Kernow now is, I don't know if you've seen from emails from CMP, but what I'm trying to do is create an online digital trail. So I've been in touch with quite a few of you, looking into the different collections and the 7 MPO museums in Cornwall. And my aim is to bring those together to create a sort of mini online exhibition, and pinpoint, these are the different queer Cornish figures. And we're spread over the whole of the southwest, the whole of Cornwall, and that represented everywhere, from Bodmin Keep, the Military Museum, to the Royal Cornwall Museum, to the Clay Museum. No matter where, we're in all the everyday life and woven into everything. What I don't want is to create this one big queer exhibition that sits siloed off on its own. It needs to be integrated in. It needs to be just normalized in a way that it's not quite there at the moment. And yeah, that's my goal for the project. Moving forward, it's gonna, it depends on everything, funding and the lockdown, who knows. But for the moment, it's gonna be a digital trail online. I'd love to speak to as many of you as possible, because beyond doing just the 7, I'd love to have a kind of interactive map of Cornwall with different pins showing all the different places you can go and learn about queer history. And yeah, I'd love to have as many as you along for the journey as possible.
Thank you, Sophie. That sounds eminently achievable to me. And it's just really amazing. I just want to reiterate my thanks to you, and also to Dan, about, you know, addressing the situation we're currently all in terms of lockdown, because effectively Sophie and Dan have been able to pivot within this crazy situation we found ourselves in and continue to work on this project in a way I couldn't have predicted, which is, it's just been fantastic, and which is why we're all here today. So Dan, without further ado, shall we think about our breakout rooms?
Yeah, it would be good to. Just before we do, I thought it would be good to just reiterate the question to Sophie, if that's all right, so that we kind of have an idea of where we want to end up with the breakout rooms, like what the some of the discussions that will come from the breakout rooms will result in. Which is the question is Sophie, what are some of the key takeaways that you'd like to come out of today with?
I think a couple of the key takeaways are: think laterally. Don't think I need to have that kind of signifier that proves this person was gay. Think, like your perfect example with the statue, think creatively and really chat to the, I hope it sparks something for people that they want to go and research in a new way, with maybe a couple of different viewpoints of how to tackle your collections. And that there's going to be something, because there is, and I really hope it, yeah, sparks that imagination.
Yeah, and I know, James, we've got you here, but we haven't really had a chance for you to talk yet. Is there anything you'd like to add before we kind of break out?
Well, I guess what was really powerful there for me, Sophie, was the idea that actually it doesn't need one big exhibition to surface queer narratives. Now, I know on one hand I'm saying that as the organisation who did Queer British Art, and was a whole exhibition that was just about queer histories. But I think, and those who comment on my session will talk a little bit about actually that was a pivot point for us, really, having that exhibition, and then opening up the organisation to have a better conversation about raising those narratives all the time. Queer audiences are in our cultural institutions all the time. We know that ours is around 19% of our audience will identify as either LGB or O. We have that data, so we have this real strong awareness that these are audiences that we need to be serving every day, and that means looking at all of our collections, looking at how we write, how we talk. And whilst a queer exhibition was a flashpoint for us, and we might revisit another queer collective story in the future, what was really important is there's things that have changed for us since then, which has been things like introducing a Queer British walkthrough held by our LGBT staff network, who surfaced stories for them that were important. Dan's working with us now on looking at LGBTQ plus tours. We have artists, and we're also going to talk about when do you call someone a queer artist, and should you, and do you, and all of those complicated, difficult things about what language means for this community to see themselves be reflected back on the walls, but also how we can project queer histories onto people. And they're really interesting nuances that go on. I remember arriving, we had, and I honestly, hand on heart say, it was the queerest programme across all of the galleries. Yet in Tate Modern at the time, we had Wolfgang Tillmans on and Rauschenberg, and both of those shows, well, not so much Tillmans because he's a very his content is very queer, but Rauschenberg really pushed back on talking about his same-sex partner later in his life. He was always referred to in his neighbour, even though in the next building along, we were having this big queer celebration. So there are these nuances that we have to work through and understand and talk about, and it's not easy. And that the historical piece is really important, especially if there are a living foundation to have a voice in that curatorial process, which isn't easy to navigate. So yeah, I don't know if I'm adding any more, but I'm excited for more conversations in the breakouts.
Thank you, James.